Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Core Web Vitals. We are just going to wait a couple of minutes for any stragglers to come on because we're bang on 3 o'clock. So just give it a couple of minutes, get started at about 2 or 3 minutes past 3. So just hang in there. Okay, so I think we're going to get going. So we'll just get this going, and here we go. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Core Web Vitals, everything you need to know about Google's upcoming update. I am Darren. I am Strategy Director here at Coast Digital. So I work with clients mostly on planning and optimizing their digital strategies and helping them get the best return for their digital investments. I have been in digital marketing for about 15 years and have worked in SEO in some facility pretty much all that time. So I have seen a lot of these updates come and go and have advised clients through some of these updates in the past. So I'm going to be able to bring some of that experience to this presentation today and try and layer in some real world experience with this update too. Today, we're going to talk specifically about Core Web Vitals. So we're going to go through what the Core Web Vitals are. We're going to talk about why you should care about them. We're going to talk about specifics on what Google is looking to measure and how you can measure those things too, so you can get a good idea of what Google is seeing. And then we're going to run through a to-do list of things that everyone should do to make sure that they're in good shape for the Core Web Vitals update, either in time for May, which is when the update kicks in, or as a longer term plan. So we'll get started by having a look at what are the Core Web Vitals. So now this is an update that's kicking in May. Google have given us about a year's notice on this in theory, and really it's a building on the typical page experience signals that Google is already using to judge a website's user experience. So you can see here these grey boxes. These are previous updates, previous changes to Google's algorithm, specifically designed around user experience that now are ranking factors. So things like mobile friendly. So is the website mobile friendly? Does it work really effectively on a mobile device? Things like safe browsing, is your server secure, and is it free of malware and things like that, or any malicious software? Are you running a security certificate? And are you encoding or encrypting user data between that they're submitting to on your website? And are you running intrusive interstitials and things like pop-ups that block the user journey and perhaps can be a bit bit intrusive and interruptive to the user journey. So those things already affect your ranking in Google. And essentially, the Core Web Vitals are the next set of additional metrics that affect that score, so your page experience ranking factor. And essentially, they are broken down into three categories. So the first is loading, so how the page loads. The second is interactivity, which is how snappy your website is when people are trying to use it. And thirdly, it's visual stability. So how much does the site move around while it's loading? Now, some of you might be thinking, and a few people have already said this to me, but isn't this the same as page speed, which we already know is a bit of a ranking factor anyway? So how quickly the page loads. And the answer to that is yes, really, they are quite similar, but they are the same but different. And this is kind of a good example of why it's different. So if we look at these two examples here between the Telegraph and the Guardian, we can see that we can see how the pages load over time, but we can also see that they both finish loading at about the 6.5 second mark. So from a page speed perspective, they're both finished loading in about the same time. But if you look at the difference between how they load, and that's the important part, how they load in, you can see that from a user's perspective, the Guardian looks loaded here at about 1 second. And if you compare that to the Telegraph, which looks like a blank page, and then even at 2 seconds, which looks like it's still filling in a lot of blanks, really the Telegraph only looks loaded towards the end of that load. So from a user experience perspective, the difference is quite big, because although they load at the same time, the way the user sees the page load is very different. And that's why this is so important, and why Google thinks this is an important thing for us to be focusing on from a user experience perspective. Now, the other thing that happens when pages load is, and we see this quite a lot, especially on news websites, is the pages move around. So assets on the page move, and we've all been in that annoying situation where you've gone to click on something and the page loads a bit more underneath with your mouse and you accidentally click on the wrong link, or you click on an ad, or in this next example, you might have added the wrong amount of items to your basket and you accidentally place your order because a pro tip jumps in and moves the submit button while you're trying to go back because you've obviously made a mistake. So this is exactly that. Like, this is a really bad example of a really extreme example of a bad user experience. And obviously, for the most part, it might just be an accidental click or a click in the wrong place. But really here, what we're looking to do is minimize this kind of movement and make sure that the pages load in efficiently, but also stably to give the users a consistent experience. So why should you care about Core Web Vitals? Well, this is a big one. It's going to affect all search results. So it's not often these days that Google do updates that affect all search results, but this one does. So it's going to have a decent impact on the overall search landscape. Sites that meet the criteria, so meet all the criteria, which we'll come on to in a second, are likely to see a rankings boost. And that's come, straight from the horse's mouth. So Google have said that. They haven't said how much of a boost or how significant it's going to be. So that's the thing to bear in mind. sites that meet the criteria might also see a different listing in the search result page. So they might see a badge or a different color or something that indicates they are providing a good user experience. And Google have said they're testing various different ways to show that in the SERPs at the moment, but they haven't shown specifics on what that might look like yet. And then lastly, if you currently get traffic from Google News, this is really important to you because to continue to gain rankings in Google News, you need to be compliant with Core Web Vitals. So that is now a ranking factor for Google News. So that's probably one of the bigger changes, I would say, across this. So from a search perspective, this is important. And from an SEO perspective, this is important. I think it's worth saying at this stage as we go through that the Core Web Vitals is part of the page experience scores, which is part of one of hundreds of other ranking factors that are all going to contribute to how you rank in the search results. And so that is something really, really important to bear in mind with all of this stuff. It is one of hundreds of factors. So just because you do this doesn't mean you get page one rankings for everything. And you know, it's more if you consider it in a way of if all sites were equal and you met the Core Web Vital rankings and your competitors didn't, you would get the edge. That's the best way to consider it, in my opinion. But we shouldn't take our eyes off all the other good best practice SEO stuff that we're doing. This should definitely be part of the considerations and part of our planning moving forwards. The other reason we should care about this, not just from a search rankings perspective, but when Google did all of their research into this and to come up with these metrics and the thresholds that they deem are relevant to the metrics, they found that if you meet all of the criteria, your users are 24% less likely to abandon page loads, which is massive if you think about that. So if you were able to go from a situation where you aren't meeting these criteria to where you are, and that gives you 25% less abandoned page loads, that is 24% more page views, essentially, which is absolutely massive. And it's going to have a huge impact on traffic levels, on potential conversion levels, and overall output from your digital platforms. So that's a massive thing. So not just are we providing a good experience for our users, we might be able to get some increases in our search results, but we might also be able to get a significant increase in our or decrease in our abandons, which is essentially an increase in our page views. So all in all, quite a useful thing for us to do. But I would caveat all of this with that we've seen over the years lots of these kind of big updates in the past, and we've also seen over the years the SEO community whip those updates up into a bit of a frenzy. So they get talked about like they're going to be complete game changers and they're going to revolutionize SEO, or they're going to cause real trouble. But sometimes then the end result is actually a bit underwhelming. And to give you a couple of examples, back in 2014, I think it was, we had the security update where Google gave us lots of heads up, said that we're going to be prioritizing pages that have a secure certificate, so HTTPS domain, and so everyone should do that. They gave us plenty of time to get it implemented, and then when the update hit, the changes were fairly minimal, and eventually non-HTTPS pages kind of got phased out. That's mainly because most people followed the advice and became a secure site. And the output of that is that users are better protected. So the user gets the better experience across the internet as a whole. The second example of this is in 2015, we had the mobile friendly update, which was termed by the SEO community Mobilegeddon as a good example of how things were whipping up into a frenzy. So Mobilegeddon was an update that where Google encouraged us all to produce a mobile experience, a specific mobile experience for mobile users. This was back in 2015. So, but yeah, so basically, again, Google encouraging us to make a change that provides a better user experience for our users and for the users of the internet in general. And similarly, Google gave us a good run up. They gave us good advice. They gave us some tools that we could use to test things. and make sure we hit the mark. And then they rolled out the update, and again, there wasn't huge changes. There was some, wasn't huge changes to rankings, but eventually all sites became mobile friendly, and that is that is a completely standard thing for us now. So, we don't know for certain, but the way the Core Web Vitals update is playing out, it looks fairly similar, right? They've given us plenty of run up, they've given us tools, they've given us research, they've shown us what we need to do, and they're going to launch the update in May. Am I expecting huge changes to the search results overnight? Probably not. Am I expecting over the course of this year for everyone to improve their user experiences to meet these? Absolutely, I am. And the output there is that the web, everyone gets better experience on the internet. So I think that's a good thing. So my point on all of this is, do we need to panic about this? I don't think so. But should we be planning and working towards it? Absolutely, yes. So that's why today's to-do list is really important, because it will help shape plans for the future. If you can get it done by May, fantastic. So please do. Okay, so we're going to talk about what Google specifically are measuring right now, and this is where we start getting into some new terminology. So the first is LCP, or largest contentful paint, and this is essentially the biggest element on the page. Essentially, is the largest contentful paint. So that might be your header image, or it might be a video, or it might be a big portion of text if you don't have a lot of images on your site. But most likely, it's going to be your header image or something like that. And what we're looking for here to get a good score, so to get in the green bar here on this on the LCP measure, is for your largest contentful paint to be done in 2.5 seconds for 75% of all page loads. So that's what Google are looking for. For the next metric, which is FID, or first input delay, this is, like I said earlier, this is about interactivity. So how quickly the site reacts to a user's input. And here Google are looking for the good score. So to get in the green bar, the first input should only be delayed by up to 100 milliseconds. So when a user clicks, the site has 100 milliseconds to react to that and do something with it. And so yeah, and that again, similarly, needs to happen on average. So across 75% of all page loads, we need a good score to get into the good category, so 100 milliseconds or less. And then the last core metric is CLS, or cumulative layout shift, and that's slightly different because it's not a time, but it's like a score. And Google are saying they want to see a score of 0.1 or smaller. And so there's a calculation that goes into this. I won't go into the gory details of it, but essentially what it's looking at is how big are the pieces of the page that move, and how far do they move, and that gives you the score per movement. And obviously then it adds up all the movements and then works out the score. So essentially we're looking to minimize the movements as much as possible to get our score down as low as possible. And again, similarly with the others, we're looking at getting this right 75% of the time. So getting 0.1 or less 75% of the time. And the reason I think Google's looking at it being 75% of the time or less on each of these is because obviously connection speeds vary, devices vary. Sometimes a device might be slow at loading things, so it might take longer on that specific device. So it gives us a bit of leeway there. But really, we should be aiming to get these scores down for as many of our page loads as possible. So just to give you an example of what a typical page loads look like, and the kind of things we're talking about with this stuff, I've gone on to our local newspaper here at Coast, which is the Colchester Gazette, and it's a good one because it loads in pretty well. There's a lot of movement on the load, and I thought it's a good example to show here. So we have, I've labeled them in terms of Core Web Vitals as well. So we have our FCP, which is our first contentful paint, and that happens at 462 milliseconds. So the first contentful paint is the first thing that comes on the screen. So in this case, it's a bit of top nav and a logo. We then have the LCP, or the largest contentful paint, which is our header image, and that is that is a thing that we're measuring for Core Web Vitals. and that happens at 495 milliseconds. So that is a pass because we're looking for 2.5 seconds at the slowest, right? So that's a good score and well under the barrier we need to get into the good category there. So that's great. But where we start to see a bit of issue now is with layout shift. So you can see with this that we've got the first layout shift here at 500 milliseconds, where there's just a few ads dropping in. But then at 2.5 seconds, we have this big additional space added here. We also have a new space added here on the right-hand navigation. So there's a bit of a pretty significant shift there. And then there's another shift on the right-hand navigation, 3.285 seconds, where the right-hand sort of ad and sort of links underneath get pushed down again, so they actually get pushed off the page this time. And then the page is finally loaded at about 4.5 seconds. And you can see why the shift is happening, right? Because it's ads loading in. So this, this is a good example of where where that user experience really is impacted, because the page load is actually gets to a place where I can see things relatively quickly. So about half a second in, I can already see the main image. I can see a few other images. I can see some stories, and I could potentially start clicking on things. But at some point in the next 2 seconds, the page is going to move, and I'm going to click on the wrong thing. And then the page might move again a second later, and I might click on something else. So you can see where the user experience starts to fall down because of the way the page is loading. And we're looking really with Core Web Vitals just to minimize that. So this would be a fail on the CLS stuff for sure, because there's so much movement on the page. They have passed on the LCP, which is good. So how can we measure Core Web Vitals for our own websites? So I'm going to take you through, there's a few different ways to do this. There's lots of different tools out there. I'm just going to take you through some of the ones that I'm using regularly at the moment. So the first is Google's PageSpeed Insights tool, and this is a really good tool, straight from the horse's mouth. So this is probably the same data that they're using to rank you. So this is why I like to use it. And it gives us clear, have we passed or have we failed on the measure? So for me, that's really, really good to see, because I like to know where I'm at with this stuff. So I've just run ASOS.com through the tool here just to give us something as a dummy page to work with. And you can see we get some kind of mixed results, right? So the 3 metrics I'm interested in are the ones with the little blue flag next to them, because that's the Core Web Vitals assessment. So we look at first input delay, and that gives me a yellow square, which is kind of needs improvement. And you can see with the bar underneath here, this field data shows that 73% of my loads are actually falling into the good category, but I'm still getting scored needs improvement because it's not 75%. So they are being really strict on that 75% measure. And what Google have said so far is that to gain any kind of rankings boost from this stuff, we need to get all 3 passes. It shouldn't be a needs improvement. It should to be better than anyone else at this, to be providing a better experience than this. Google are saying we expect you to pass all of them, not just 1 or 2. So that's something to bear in mind. So with our first input delay here, actually, we're doing all right, 112 milliseconds on average, and we need 100 milliseconds to, on average, across our 75% of our loads to pass. So we're really close. So a small change to some small changes here, some small optimizations might help creep that down into 75%. We've then got our largest contentful paint, which has got a green circle next to it, which means it's passed. And you can see that 79% of our page loads are passing that. And that's because we've averaged 2.3 seconds. And the kind of threshold is 2.5 seconds. So that's good. And then we can see cumulative layout shift, CLS, it's got a red triangle next to it, which is a big fat fail. And that is because we're scoring 0.31. So, and you can see here that actually the scores are much more heavily distributed to the red section. So 34% of our loads are having a really bad time with layout shift. So that, if I was ASOS, is where I would start. I would look at our layout shift and see what I could do to minimize that and I'll talk about some tips for that coming up. As well as the page speed insights, I use Search Console quite regularly, so we can look at the Core Web Vitals section in Search Console, which is under Experience. And this gives us just some aggregated reports, basically, on how the site performs as a whole, so how your own website performs as a whole. You can quickly look at the sites or the pages that are ranking poorly, and then underneath it shows specifics. So, for example, here you can see it says 872 pages, but there are 2 issues. And below that, it shows the 2 issues are there's a CLS issue more than 0.25 on mobile. So, and that affects 864 URLs. So if I can fix that structurally, then I can fix that across most of my website, which is going to bring my score right down, which is great. And then the other issue here only affects 20 pages, which is the LCP is big, is longer than 4 seconds on mobile. So I might just want to have a look into that, look at those pages, look at what the LCP is, and then I can maybe optimize that load in. So that's a really handy tool, and it gets you through a lot quite quickly. If you're browsing your own website and just wanting to see how the page loads happen page by page, I recommend getting like an extension to Chrome or whichever browser you use. I use Chrome, and I use this extension, Web Vitals. It gives you a square on your extensions tab, and it colors it red, green, depending on if you passed, failed. So that's pretty handy. So I can very quickly see if a page is failing or passing Core Web Vitals checks. And again, if I just took the screenshot while I was on ASOS, you can see that layout shift has failed here as well. So that's where I'd focus my efforts on ASOS. And then lastly, if you're a bit more technical, you might use the Chrome DevTools. So in Google Chrome, you can press F12, and then you can press Performance in this tab here, and then that essentially opens up a really kind of gorily detailed view of how the page loads. It's absolutely brilliant if you can get your head around it. The most important part to look at is this kind of interactions, timing, and experience section, where it maps out under experience. It draws in layout shift, and so this is like a timeline of how the page loads. So it maps in layout shift. It also maps in first contentful paint and largest contentful paint. And if we click on any of these, it highlights them in the page. So this comes up as like a little tab. I can click on one of these, so I can click on LCP, and then it will show me in the page what my LCP is, so what my largest contentful paint is. So I can look at which image it is, or which video it is, or whatever, and then I can optimize that if I want to. If I click on the layout shift, it will show me which elements are causing the shift to happen. So that's really, really handy to quickly get an understanding of what's actually happening during the load, so I can make some changes. So yeah, so that's a really cool tool. If you've got the time to get into that level of detail, it's worth it. But if not, the Page Speed Insights tool gives you a good list of stuff to work on. Okay, so that's how typically we measure those measures that Google is looking for. The next step is, what do we do about it, right? So so where do we start and what do we do? So the thing to remember is, as I've said, Core Web Vitals is just one part of the page experience signals. My suggestion would be, if you aren't meeting the previous signals, so mobile friendly, safe browsing, and so on, then Core Web Vitals is probably the least of your worries. So I would start with all of the previous ones and then move into Core Web Vitals. So very quickly, we can check mobile usability using the mobile friendly test that Google has provided. Definitely check your website through that. Again, there's a link at the bottom there, so you can see and get out to that tool. But it's definitely worth checking your site in that. If there are any issues, fix those before you worry about Core Web Vitals, because this is a higher priority, I would say. Security, make sure your security certificate's up to date. Make sure it's going to renew. Don't let it run out. Make sure that you're handling personal data securely. It might be worth, if you haven't done it for a while, check your server for malware, for anything malicious, for anything sneaky that's got in there. Just make sure, as a sense check, that that's all done at the very least, and then just review the site from a interstitials pop-ups perspective, and just think about how intrusive they are. So just as a couple of examples, this one on New York Times, in my opinion, is very intrusive. It blocks the vast majority of the page. It it is interruptive to the user experience, and the user has to take an action to get it out of their way before they can continue. So either click the continue button or click the close button. And for me, that probably causes some issues on the user experience front from Google's perspective. There is a better example on the right-hand side with Missguided, which is like a small pop-up at the bottom. I can still use the rest of the site. I can still browse the categories. I can still get to the navigation, and I can completely ignore the extra 20% off if I want to, or I can just close it. But it doesn't interrupt me. I can carry on with my journey, and that's a good trade-off to make. So let's make sure we've checked all those things before we worry about Core Web Vitals. Then I'd run your site through PageSpeed Insights tool. That's usually my first step. And essentially I'm looking to work out here what my priorities are. So as I said earlier, I'm looking at where am I passing, where am I failing, where are my biggest failings? And that allows me to kind of head in the right direction. As you scroll down on the PageSpeed Insights tool, you can see some specific recommendations to help improve load speed and things like that, but also to help you, because there is crossover between those two things, to help you meet some of these Core Web Vitals. So I'm going to talk about some of those things now. I'm going to talk about optimizing images first, because although image optimization is a task that you would carry out to improve your load speed, your page load speed, images are pretty much, well, almost certainly going to be your LCP. So your large contentful paint is probably going to be an image, right? So if we get that right and we get that sized right and so that it loads efficiently, we're likely to meet that FCP score every time. So that's a really important thing to do. The way that we optimize images is we size them properly. So we get images that are the right dimensions for the gap that they're about to go in, and we encode them correctly. So we save them as the right file format, but also with the right amount of compression. So I'm going to talk about what those two things mean. How do you optimize your image from that perspective? Well, it really depends on you and your website and how many people are uploading things and where your images are coming from and all of that stuff. And so there are different ways to handle that. So firstly, there's like the manual option, which is use something like Photoshop, open up your image, resize it to the right dimensions, save it in the right format, so like a JPEG or whatever, compress it to the right amount, and then re-upload it back to the website and replace the higher res image that might be there. So that's one thing. Obviously, that's quite a manual process. If you've got someone that's producing you regular images to upload to the website or to use on the website, new visual assets and things like that, just make sure that they're being sized in the right way from the start, and that will mean there can be no mistakes when you're uploading them. Is definitely my advice there. If you've got loads and loads of images that you need to do in a batch, and you don't have an easy way to do that, something like TinyPNG can work quite nicely. It's like a semi-automated option where you upload a batch of images and it will spit them all out in PNG format for you, so kind of compressed effectively, which is good. That's a good way to get there. It doesn't do too much with the dimensions, but it does compress them effectively, and we'll talk about compression in a sec. But that's an important step. If you've got a advanced content management system or something where you can add plugins to it, so something like WordPress, which we use here at Coast, you can add a plugin that handles some of this stuff for you. So we use Smush Pro, which is a specific plugin that deals with any images that are uploaded, and it helps to create various sized images, different dimensions, so that it can pick the one that's nearest to the size that it needs while it's loading the page. So that helps with making sure that we're not loading images that are way too big for what we need. And again, that is fully automated. It also helps when there are lots of people uploading content to our website. So we've got a big content management system with lots of potential contributors, people that are uploading content. It's hard to get consistency around image sizes and that kind of thing. So having something that automates that process and just checks it as people are uploading things is really valuable. So I definitely recommend pushing towards that automated option if you can, because it will make life a lot easier and a lot tidier if it's consistent. And when we talk about compression, you can see some differences here in just how images can be compressed. And what impact that has. So on the right hand side, we've got a JPEG that is saved with a low compression, so is a bigger file size, so 590 kilobytes, and that that is a pretty chunky image. I can compress that down to 150 kilobytes, which is this middle version, and you can see actually the image has barely degraded at all to the human eye, at least, and so I can't really tell too much difference between the two images. I've saved 75% in file size though, and so that image is going to load. That middle image is going to load about 4 times quicker than the one on the right, and is going to make very little difference to the user experience altogether, because we've lost very little in the compression. So this is why optimizing images is really important. If I can save, if I can speed up my image load by 75% just by doing a bit of compression and sizing, then that's going to make a massive difference overall to my load speed, but more importantly to my Contentful Paint and my large Contentful Paint speed. So it's going to get me some much better scores from a Core Web Vitals perspective. It's really worth just making sure you're not going too hard on the compression though, because you don't want to end up with something like this on the left where you've over compressed and the quality is dropped, because that negatively affects the user experience, because the site then doesn't look anywhere near as nice. So it's about finding the right balance on the image compression front. Also with images, I've kind of hinted at this already, but the way images load into the page, or not just necessarily images, content in general load into the page is really important. You can see this example on the left-hand side, the BBC weather page on mobile device. You can see it as it loads in. I can see the page, I can see the content, I can see a bit of forecast. So I might go and click on the Thursday tab. But as I do that, the cookie notice bumps in, kicks all the content down, and then I end up clicking on the plus instead, or maybe I end up clicking on the search bar instead, and that provides me a bad experience. And because it's annoying, right? We've all been there. So one of the ways you can get around that is essentially reserve space for content and images to load into, and CNN do that. You can see this example on the right here, where the content is loaded in, and the frame of the layout of the page is loaded in, and there's just a big black space here for an image to load into. Obviously, images take longer to load because they're bigger, so they've reserved a space for that image, and then as it loads in, the text beneath it doesn't move because there's already a space for that image to load into. So that is really important, and that helps with obviously knowing the dimensions of your images up front, which is good, but also helps with layout shift, because things aren't then bumping around the page as the page loads, which is what we want. It's worth noting for publishers, so this example we had before where there is a lot of adverts on the page, that can be quite difficult. All right, so layout shift for publishers I think is going to be a real challenge. Most ads are bought dynamically these days and sold dynamically these days, and so you don't always know what size the ad is going to be, what format the ad's going to be, so it's hard to reserve space for it. My suggestion would be reserve space for what you can, and try and plan for some of that stuff. And then it's really a case of managing your your ad revenue versus your ad revenue versus your user experience. And I think that's going to be the trade-off. It could be that you drop some dynamic ads and put some more fixed ad units in, and that might negatively affect your ad revenue, but might keep you in Google News because your layout shift is small enough to pass Core Web Vitals, and being in Google News might get you enough traffic to be worth the drop in ad revenue. So it's going to be about balancing those things. I think definitely publishers got the hardest job, or any site that has lots of adverts has got a really tough job. I think really the thing you've got to remember is all publishers are in the same boat. And I think most publishers will struggle to meet the layout shift stuff. So I think everyone will be in the same boat there. So I think it'll be tough to get a competitive advantage from that perspective. One of the other things we can do from a Core Web Vitals perspective is preload key resources. So And really we're talking about CSS and fonts. So we can preload those in. So essentially stick them in the head and get the browser to get them ready in advance of the load, so it knows what it's working with straight away. And that just helps with, for things like fonts, for things like CSS, it just helps with the load, and it helps reduce layout shift as the page loads in. Just makes it more efficient. So definitely worth doing that. It's relatively simple to do. It's about picking the right assets and then sticking them in the head with this little link preload snippet around it, and then the browser knows what it's looking for. So that's definitely worth doing. The last thing is more complex and definitely more technical, so you probably need developer support for this part. But one of the things you can do in the Chrome DevTools is look at tasks, and tasks are essentially the jobs that the browser is trying to do to load the page. You can see in the DevTools, you've got these tasks all kind of lined up in a row, right? So this is like the main run of tasks that are happening, and you can see that there's lots of little tasks that are happening, but there's some big tasks as well. And I've highlighted this big task here, and you can see that after about a third of the way through, there's some red lines drawn across it, and that's to indicate that it's a long task, because it's a big chunk of stuff that's happening. And you can see this long task has taken 150 milliseconds. So the reason this is important is because if we think about our first input delay measure, we are trying to get our first input delay under 100 milliseconds to be in the good category. Now, if a user clicks just as this task has started, the site isn't going to be able to do anything for 150 milliseconds, most likely, or thereabouts, because it's doing this task first. So it will do this task first, then it will react to the click once it's done. So long tasks like this are going to cause issues with input delay. So what we need to do, and what we're going to ask our developers to do, is look at these long tasks and see if there's a way that they can break them up. So break them up into smaller chunks, essentially, so that there are gaps in between them, and so that the site can be more reactive to a user's inputs. So that's definitely a worthwhile task, especially if there's some really long tasks. There's not too many long ones, like really long ones here, but I've seen a lot worse than this, and it's really worth breaking those down where you can. And again, that's a job you're going to ask your developers to do, and because you need technical know-how to get that done. So if you've been able to do all of that, and you're still not meeting your Core Web Vitals, especially on large contentful paint, you might need to look at your technology and your hardware, essentially. So, is my server good enough to load these images in quick enough? Have I got enough? Is there enough bandwidth? Am I able to serve the visitor base that I've got effectively with the server I've got? Those are all things that we might need to ask at this point. If you've done everything else and you're still struggling, then this is where you need to look. So just as a quick rundown of our checklist, we should check mobile usability. We should check that the site is secure and that we're set up for that for the long term, that there's no really intrusive pop-ups or anything that's going to get in the way of the user journey before we worry about Core Web Vitals. We can then use the PageSpeed Insights tool to look at what's going on, where we're passing and failing, and prioritizing our work. We would then most likely look to optimize images, kind of manage our layout shift, so minimize our layout shift by reserving spaces and preloading key resources. We then look to minimize long blocking tasks so that our input delay is lower. And then lastly, we will check our server setups if we're still struggling to hit some of the scores. Cool. So hopefully that's shed some light on what Core Web Vitals is and how we can tackle it. I just want to bring us back to this just as a refresher. My view on this is that obviously the update's happening in May. I don't expect we're going to see huge changes in May, but we are going to see a trend of this becoming the norm and these metrics becoming normal things that we all look at and that we plan when we're building websites and we're optimizing websites. So the sooner we start getting into this stuff, the better, because this is going to become the norm because Google's now enforcing it, and everyone wants to do well by Google. So we should all start getting in this frame of mind that this is an important thing for us to think about. Whether we get it done by May or not, I don't think is as critical, but we should definitely be planning to get things done as soon as we can. I would also just draw attention back to this stat, which is the whole, for me, wraps up the whole thing. In all of Google's research across millions of page views, they found that users are 24% less likely to abandon page loads if we meet the Core Web Vitals. And for me, I don't think there's any marketing manager in the world that doesn't want 24% less page abandons. So for me, this is where this all accumulates and is worth every penny that we put into it.